All right, I'm going to share my screen. Come on. All right, so a lot of you remembered from last time and from your assignment, one of the main ways that bison influence the prairie, and that's by making these wallows. How might this influence heterogeneity in the prairie plant community? Anyone want to share what their group talked about?
I mean, we didn't really find this out, but when he came into our group, he mentioned how this like kind of creates like mud pits and ponds instead of like, you know, grass there.
Yeah, and do you think that some plants are maybe better adapted to living in small pools or wetlands than they are to maybe in a grassland?
Probably.
Yeah, so you get these patches, even after the wallow itself is gone and the bison aren't using it anymore, you might see areas where the plants are a little bit different. And maybe some of the amphibians or insects that are using those plants or using those wet spots are a little bit different than elsewhere in the prairie. So this creates patches of kind of slightly different subcommunities within a broader grassland community. So at a small scale, you might zoom into the middle of an old wallow and see one set of plants and amphibians and insects and things. And you go to another area of the prairie where there hasn't been a wallow for decades, and you see a different set of plants and animals. And it might look like you've got two little local communities. But as you zoom out and think bigger, the prairie is full of these wallows. The bison are making them all the time. And so both subsets of species are part of the same prairie community. And it just kind of depends on whether you're looking at things at a very small scale or at a very broad scale. Over all of the cons of prairie, you might have a very predictable abundance of certain salamanders and wetland plants, such that they don't seem like they're unusual or not prairie plants, but they in fact are part of the prairie, and it's just part of the natural variation in the landscape because of the presence of bison. Several of you had this one, right? Bison die. And in fact, the deaths of bison are studied very closely and carefully at Cons of Prairie, and they know kind of how many bison are born each year. They can figure out about how many die each year. You get about, and they know the density of bison on the landscape. So when a bison dies, what is that going to do to nutrients locally in a patch of land?
It'll increase the nutrients.
Yeah, it increases the nutrients dramatically, at least initially. Notice this bison carcass here. There are no plants right around the bison. It probably didn't find a spot with no plants and lay it down there to die, right? This is what we call a ring of death, and the nutrient levels in this air in the soil around the bison are so high that in fact it inhibits plant growth for several species, sort of a nutrient overload. And then as you get away from the ring of death, you can see that there's sort of abundant plant growth, especially over here in the corner. And then as you get further away, you kind of return to those background nutrient levels typical of prairie soils at Kanza. This person here is actually doing a soil sample transect, going away from the bison, looking at nutrient levels. And because there's a certain density of bison and there's a certain birth rate and death rate, we have a pretty good sense of the frequency with which these sort of big nutrient inputs occur on the landscape and contribute to heterogeneity of resource availability for the plants. Um, and then the one other that I didn't have a slide for, right, is what did you guys find for the two other things that bison do that I don't have a slide for?
Like graze and then poop.
Yeah, so urinating and defecating are two ways that they are putting nutrients back into the soil. Basically, all the nutrients that don't become bison become feces and urine and go back into the soil. Yeah, I didn't actually have a slide for grazing this week, but last time we had this. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the effect of grazing as we get into the fire. But it's worth pointing out here that bison, like most animals, have preferences. They prefer some grasses or some forbs to other plants. And so they'll, as they remove biomass, they're often doing it in a biased way. They're eating the things that grow fast, that are especially tasty, that bison prefer, and often leaving behind things that they don't. Maybe things that are well defended against by specifically. So now if we return to the map of Kanza, who remembers what the different numbers mean in on the map here? Or maybe let's walk through the codes. Who remembers what the letters mean? N, K, and C.
N is native, right?
Yep. Native what? Do you remember? Or is anybody else?
Native grazers.
Yeah, it refers to the native grazers, basically the bison. And so then what's the C refer to?
Is it cattle maybe?
Yep, there you go. It's the non-native grazers. So we've got the effect of grazers and of native and non-native grazers. And the K, did I write it down? Who knows what the K is?
It's non-grazed.
Yeah. So they've got these large watershed areas that are either grazed or ungrazed, and they've got two different kinds of grazers. Who can tell me what a watershed is?
Isn't it a little dam?
They do have dams. And
That's a
part of-
weir.
right? Say it again.
Isn't that a weir or a wire?
Yeah, a weir. At least that's how I've always pronounced it, a weir. Those are little dams that are used to help sort of differentiate the different watersheds. But basically what we've got here are natural boundaries that are defined based on drainage patterns. So these lines that separate the watersheds are kind of like high points or ridges, such that all the rain that falls within a watershed exits that watershed through the streams or the gullies at a specific point. So in this case, N20B, this is where all the water leaves that falls within this region. So a watershed is a drainage area, basically. And it's been useful to find these kind of natural boundaries between different patches. And what about the numbers? What do the numbers mean?
Isn't it like the year they were burned or whatever, or how often they're burned?
Yeah, how often they're burned. Yep, it's the fire frequency. Every 20 years, every 4 years, every year. They have several different frequencies. In the study you're going to be looking at, Veen et al., we only use 2 of those frequencies, but other studies might make use of more of them. And then what about the letters at the end, the A, B, C, D?
They're replicates of similar treatments.
Yeah, so you're getting native grazers burned every 20 years. There might be 2 different watersheds or up to 4 different watersheds that have that same combination of influences. So they just distinguish those using these letters at the end. Good. The replicates.
I'm gonna fall asleep in my next class.
All right, we'll try to make it exciting with some fire then. All right, so what are the
Wait,
effects
I didn't catch that comment.
of
I'm sorry, that was an accident.
What did you say?
I was reading your comment about Connor carrying the conversation, and I was saying that I need to start doing that because I'm gonna fall asleep if I don't start participating more.
Okay, well, good.
Sorry, I didn't mean to unmute myself to say that.
So what do you guys think? Let's brainstorm a little bit about how might fire affect the community, affect the prairie community. There's some obvious ways, maybe some not so obvious ways that we'll talk about. If you could participate early, you can get the easy ones.
Doesn't it kill all the plant life?
Yeah, it'll kill most of it, right?
Yeah.
The more fuel, the more plant biomass there is. Generally, the stronger the fire, the higher the heat, the more the plants are removed from the system. Yeah. What else?
I guess like when like the plants are killed, it allows like new species of plants to come in and kind of take over. So there's like a different variety.
Yeah, you can think of it similar to the way we talk about the wallows. It's creating new sort of ecological space, right? New physical space and resources that can be used by fresh plants that colonize. Now, some of these colonizers might actually be survivors. Many prairie plants have their underground stems or roots adapted to withstanding some moderate heat from fire above, and so they're able to resprout quickly. Others have small seeds that are easily able to reach those new exposed patches right after the fire passes through. So there's survivors and there's colonizers, and they both try to take advantage of that new space. Yep. What else? When we think about organisms dying, in this case, the plants dying from the fire, the ones that do anyway, it's not so much the fact that it's not living anymore, that it's given up the ghost that matters to the community. It's what happens to the stuff that was the plant. So think about it in terms of nutrients.
Isn't it like carbon dioxide or something?
Yeah, some of the carbon that was the plants is combusted and lost as carbon dioxide. But what happens to, what else happens to some of that carbon as shown in the image here? What do you get if you incompletely burn plant matter?
Becomes ash. Sits on the
Ash and charcoal. Yeah. So a lot of carbon just goes right back into the soil as ash and charcoal. There are other nutrients in plants that are important for the growth of organisms, things like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. And some of those nutrients are returned back to the soil as unburned plant biomass. And some of those things are actually volatilized and lost to the atmosphere just the way carbon dioxide is. Certain amounts of nitrogen get volatilized and lost to the atmosphere, but some other proportion of the nitrogen that was the plant matter is returned to the soil as plant debris or unburned plant matter. So there's a lot happening, right? The fire burns through and it affects all these different nutrients in different ways. Some of it goes back to the soil, some of it is lost. The intensity of the fire might have an influence on that, and how hot the fire burns might also have an influence on that. Prairie fires have been managed by people for hundreds of years. Native Americans regularly burned prairies, partly to keep trees from growing and promote the kinds of plants and animals that live in the prairie and keep the trees kind of at bay. Then there was a long period where prairies kind of weren't burned because it was mostly European settlers managing prairies to prevent fires. And now we know that fires are a really important part of the prairie ecosystem, and there are a lot of things that we like about prairies that are frequently burned. And so at Kanza, they're studying the effects of these different fire burn frequencies experimentally. So here's a person working on creating a fire line. They start downwind in an area that's supposed to be burned, and they create these kind of low burning fires, fire lines in two areas that are downwind, and gradually they lengthen the kind of fire line and eventually bring the two together. And once the two come together, the wind sort of sweeps the fire through the whole area and burns everything. They have fire breaks built into the landscape at Kanza. Notice the roads and these sort of mowed down areas that help define the places that are supposed to be burned at different frequencies. You can see this person starting the fire and working their way towards the other line, eventually to connect them. The variation in the amount of plant matter and the type of plant matter, whether it burns well or burns poorly, and the frequency with which fires are burned, all work together to create heterogeneity. Within a plot, you can see bands of more or less charcoal or more or less burned material as the fire covered an area. You can see that down where there's more water in the soil, where the trees are, there's less effective burning, but up high on the prairie, where it's mostly grasses and forbs, the fire is more intense, but it varies with the soil type and plant type. And then of course, there's this large scale heterogeneity between different patches that's influenced both by the frequency of burning, but also not all the burn frequencies are set up on exactly the same year. So you can get large scale heterogeneity like this, where you've got freshly burned areas that have more or less burned areas within them, adjacent to areas that haven't been burned for years, and places that have been burned more recently. And you can see the fire breaks that are built into the landscape. So large scale and small scale heterogeneity is built into the system, and you can look at it at both local areas and kind of regional or watershed scale areas. From above, this is what you might see. Two adjacent patches, probably at different burn frequencies, but burned the same year, adjacent to other patches that have not been burned recently. So these are sort of the four main points that I hope we've covered well last time and this time, talking about sort of the landforms and the geologic history of Kanza, the climate and what controls climate generally, the importance of grazing and the grazers themselves for nutrient cycling and how that affects the plants, and then fire. Fire influences the plant community by creating heterogeneity of nutrient availability and kind of heterogeneity of history of fire burns. And one thing that I've tried to hit on a couple times is that you can look at these things at the scale of a few meters, maybe a single plot, compare different plots of a square meter, or you can look at it across whole watersheds or within a watershed across hundreds of meters or tens of meters. So scale can really influence the kinds of patterns that we're interested in. What looks like two different subcommunities within a prairie, just a few meters from each other as a result of bison wallows. If you zoom out, all of those plants, the ones that specialize in wallows and the ones that specialize away from wallows, are part of the general prairie community that we might call homogeneous. But at a smaller scale, there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of which plants and animals live in which places. And there's a link here that I'd like you to explore after class that takes you to a website that shows kind of an artistic way how certain kinds of patterns can emerge from other patterns as you change scale. So you'll see that Chris Jordan has used that phenomenon to create images from other images in a really interesting way that illustrates the effect of scale, the scale at which you're looking at something, zoomed in or zoomed out. I'm just going to switch slideshows here. Any questions while I switch up?
Nathan, while you're switching, for those of you not looking at the chat, there was that photo of the aerial view of the watersheds. One of the nice things about that photo is it also illustrates kind of what a watershed is, because you can see the watershed with a stream coming down, and at the very bottom you can see a little concrete weir. So if you guys were struggling with kind of why a watershed would be set up that way and why they sample watersheds, it's because everything that falls on that watershed exits that watershed at that point where that little concrete weir is that was down at the lower part of that photo. So if you were struggling with what watersheds are, how they're structured, that was a particularly good image to illustrate that.
Okay. So I've got two different slideshows here, and I'm just about ready. All right, we're gonna come back to our prairie organisms of the day. I have a few here, but I'm running low on time, so I want to get into this disturbance and succession stuff. There we go. All right. Are you guys seeing the disturbance and succession slide? Good. Okay, we're going to define two new terms, and this will probably bleed over into the next class a little bit, Paul, if that's okay. We're going to talk about disturbance and succession. So you need to know what these terms mean. There's a nice discussion of them in your textbook, so you can read about that as you study. We want you to know what disturbance is, what we mean by disturbance, and what are its consequences. And that'll lead directly into this question of what do we mean by ecological succession, and how it's different from other kinds of ecological change or community change. We'll provide some examples there. So here are two definitions of what we mean by ecological disturbance. I'm going to read the bottom one. It's a relatively discrete event, discrete in time or space or sort of in conceptualization, that alters the structure of a community, alters the structure of the populations and the ecosystem as a whole, that changes resource availability or changes the physical environment. So we've been talking about some of these things already. Fire, bison wallows, these are all disturbance events that change the environment and change resource availability. When these changes happen, it creates opportunity for new individuals or colonies, new populations of organisms to become established, which is what's included in the definition above. There are several different ways that we can classify disturbances. I've got a few of them here. These are dyads. These are sort of two ends of a spectrum. You could have things that you might call more natural or non-human caused disturbance events versus things that are caused by activities of people. They can be large in their scale or smaller in their scale. The frequency can vary. You might have frequent disturbance events or infrequent disturbance events, and they might be regular or irregular. So I could add one in here maybe, or a subpoint. You could have frequent irregular disturbances or frequent regular disturbances. Maybe you all have heard about flooding. They talk about the 100-year flood or the 50-year flood. These things don't actually happen every 50 years. It just works out to be sort of on average that way. So they're irregular, but on average, they have a given frequency, which might be about 1 every 50 years. So it's a little bit confusing because you can have, if you got a few wet years, you can have 2 50-year floods next to each other. But other times you might have 100 years between them. Disturbance events might be severe or mild. Maybe they kill a few individuals. Maybe just a few species are influenced. May be severe, such that most species are influenced or removed from the community. And then this last one is press or pulse. So this refers to things that are more drawn out or more discrete in time. So
Nathan?
yeah.
Can I interject something here?
Yeah.
Your example of the flood thing is useful and informative, but it also points out the fact that these different ways of classifying disturbances aren't necessarily independent of one another. The whole reason that you have 100-year floods is because they are infrequent, but the reason that they're infrequent is they are also typically large scale and severe. So these different classification schemes aren't independent. I know you recognize that, but I wanted to make sure that they were making that connection.
Yeah. So the reason that I've put up here 5 different spectrums of ways you could classify a disturbance is that you can take any pair here, or any 2 bullet points, and construct kind of a disturbance space, right? So we could take intensity and frequency. So I've got this severe mild. That could be our mild would be low intensity and severe would be high frequency. And then I've got, high intensity would be severe. So that's one axis, and another axis is low and high frequency. I could have picked any 2 of these bullet points and put them on the X and the Y axis. And then we can start to imagine some disturbances and where they would fit on these, on this plane. And if I had a 3-dimensional computer screen, a little hologram for you all in your dorm rooms, then we could put a 3rd axis on there and classify things in 3 dimensions. And if we were 4-dimensional beings, right, we could do more. But we can simplify these things and look at them 2 at a time. So what kinds of disturbance events come to mind when you guys are hearing about ecological disturbance? I haven't listed a whole lot. We've talked about fire and grazing, but what other things do you think of when you think of ecological disturbance?
Well, like on a grand scale, global warming or climate change.
Yeah, okay, so that's going to be a large scale change, and it's going to probably classify that as a press change, right? It's kind of slow and drawn out, at least from our perspective. I'd also point out, though, that it's a really heterogeneous influence, right? Different communities and different environments are going to experience that in very different ways. That's a good one. Anybody else?
Invasive species.
That's an interesting one because it's biotic, right? And most of the things we talked about are sort of more or less abiotic. How would you classify an invasive species as a disturbance event?
I'm not sure.
It's not incorrect. I often think of invasive species as a response to disturbance. It's a species that happens to be from somewhere else, colonizing an area, usually because people have changed the environment in some way that is such that it's disturbed. But you can also get species that invade communities because they don't have any enemies, right? No herbivores or pathogens that kill them. So they enter a community and they have this advantage, and they can remove a lot of the biomass of other organisms. So you can think of it as a disturbance if they have negative effects on most of the other organisms in the community. Anybody else?
Let me add to that. So, we think of bush honeysuckle, which you guys have seen out there at Martha Lafitte Thompson. That's a species that is a really good competitor for light. And underneath those canopies, it's definitely changed the amount of biomass and the community structure of the plant community and things like that. Then there are cases in the American West where you have these introduced grass species growing up. And as a result of that, when fires do happen, they get carried faster. And so in that case, the organism itself might not be the disturbance, but what it does is it has altered the frequency and severity of the disturbances as a result of its presence on the landscape.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's not just plants that do that. There was recently a study that was showing that there are these firehawk birds that create fires to expose rodents and other kinds of prey in Australia. So these birds will alter the frequency of fire in an area in order to get access to their prey. And as invasive grass species move in and the firehawk birds start the fires, the frequency and intensity of fires increases.
Yeah,
So you
that's
can get-
cool. I haven't heard about that.
Yeah, the firehawk behavior in Australia is. And it was originally studied because they heard stories from indigenous peoples who talked about these birds starting fires. And they actually went out and did the work, and it turned out they were. So these are some of these different things we've talked about. You can kind of try to put on one of these axes. So we've talked about fires. We've talked about flooding a little bit and grazing. There's also the effect of humans, right? We convert land that was once undeveloped to either, in the case of prairies, into agricultural landscapes, but often we put in new suburbs or other kinds of urbanization. And you can kind of put these things along the two axes. Now I've put fires on here at kind of low intensity and high frequency. Can you guys think of any other places that you might want to put fires based on recent stuff in the news over the last several months, I guess?
There are fires in California and Colorado, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so there are ecosystems, there are communities where fire frequency can be really intense. And sometimes that's a result of the climate being sort of prone to fire. And sometimes it's a result of people suppressing fires. And so fuel building up, forest litter or other kinds of plants building up such that when the fires do finally come through, they're more intense. And out in California right now, those two things are interacting. You've got those dry summers, lots of fuel, lots of fire suppression historically, as well as climate change, all interacting to take what would be maybe fires down here in the low intensity and moving it up into higher intensity and maybe more frequent as well. So as I said before, we could take these things and think about them in multidimensional space as many different combinations of ways of conceptualizing disturbances as you can fit into your brain, and put those different disturbance events in this sort of disturbance space. It should remind you a little bit of the PCA, right? You had beak space defined by length, width, and depth. Here, we're, instead of using beak dimensions, we're using intensity and frequency and scale of disturbance events to plot those events in this conceptual space. Now, as a really good example of disturbance and what comes next, I put up here Mount St. Helens eruption, or I guess Paul did. But this is Mount St. Helens in 1980. I remember seeing documentaries about this as a kid, because it had been about, by the time I was 95, I was maybe 10 years old. This had happened 10 years ago. People have been watching and studying the process ever since then. So Mount St. Helens is out in the Cascades region in southern Washington state. And this is what it looked like on May 17th, 1980. And the next day it looked like this. So we had these pyroclastic flows, these ash flows that buried most of the landscape near the eruption. The impact itself knocked down plants and animals much further away. And the ash cloud that kind of rained down out of the atmosphere afterwards spread over much of eastern Washington, and to a lesser extent, all the way to Wyoming and to western Nebraska, as you can see up here on the map. This is what it looks like in 2015. Notice that there's a lot more plant life than we saw last time. There's a lot more erosion and sort of cutting of these gullies and streams into the ash flows and the lahar flows. And the community is kind of coming back. The plants are coming back, often in a very different way. So this is a close-up of an area called Harrington Creek on the debris avalanche deposit. This creek didn't exist before the eruption, and it's only been forming since the eruption as a result of erosion and colonization by plants that live along riparian or live along water areas, water courses. And it's continued to develop. As the canopy grows, more plants come in, and we call this process succession. So here in 87, it's mostly willows and alders. And then you get in other kinds of trees, birches and things that make more shade. And the shade allows certain kinds of ferns and understory plants to survive, changing the environment in a way that favors later and later plant species to come in and the animals that depend on those. So we're going to pick up this discussion of succession next time, and then we'll transition into talking about how disturbance and succession interact, which is going to be a really important point for understanding the Vina et al. Paper, these interaction effects. So keep that in mind, and I will see you all on Friday.